The Wimbledon tennis tournament closed on Sunday for another year. The men's final and some previous matches saw protests by a group of human rights activists asking a simple question on the whereabouts of Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai. Earlier, NTD's David English spoke with one of the protesters, human rights activist Drew Pavlo. Pavlo led the Where's Peng Shuai campaign at the Australian Open and flew to the UK to share the message at Wimbledon. He told us about the situation of the former Wimbledon women's doubles champion.
She's a very famous tennis star. She's been touring across the world, playing in all Grand Slams. And last year, when she made an allegation against China's vice premier involving rape and sexual assault, her social media was scrubbed clean, and she was basically her existence was basically wiped clean from the internet in China. She basically disappeared for a number of weeks. When she reappeared, she was in these very concerning staged videos that appeared to be almost like hostage-like videos.
Where do you think Peng is now, and what do you think is her situation?
She's not able to speak freely to this day. We don't know the exact nature of her conditions because the Chinese government is so opaque. We don't know much about what happens when the Chinese Communist Party tries to disappear people.
So you were at the men's final on Sunday, and you got up, you said something, and then the security came over.
I just wanted to hold up silently a sign that said, "Where is Peng Shuai?" And as soon as I picked up that sign and I tried to hold it up, security basically tackled me. They tried to put my hands behind my back. They were ripping the poster away from me. And so it was at that point I thought, I've come all this way. I've got to try and make sure that this message doesn't get completely lost. And so I yelled out, "Where is Peng Shuai? Where is Peng Shuai? This Chinese tennis star has been persecuted by the Chinese government. Why won't Wimbledon say something?"
Tragedy strikes social media, and popular video sharing app TikTok is feeling the heat. On top of allegations that the company leaked American user data to China, TikTok now faces a lawsuit of the death of 2 children. NTD's Phil Zhou has the latest.
The blackout challenge has been gaining popularity on TikTok recently. Users are encouraged to choke themselves until they pass out, all while filming the stunt in hopes to get some views and likes.
And we as parents wonder, where did you get that from? Why are you doing that?
2 young girls, ages 8 and 9, died last year after attempting the blackout challenge. Now the parents are suing the social media company, saying the TikTok algorithm pushes harmful content to children, leading to death. Omar Ochoa is a top trial attorney who's represented some of the biggest firms across the globe.
I think there is a wave in this country to try to hold accountability for social media companies, both for confidentiality, privacy protections, and to make sure that they're generating content that's not harmful.
The lawsuit claims TikTok knew its videos are addictive but failed to warn children and parents about them. Dr. Christopher Cortman has been a psychologist for over 36 years. He even has his own TikTok channel promoting mental health and tips on parenting.
You know, when you're talking about ages 8 and 9, it is up to me as the dad, it's up to the mom to make sure that I know what's going into my child's brains, into their eyes, into their ears.
Both girls who died received their first smartphones at the ages of only 7 and 8. Dr. Cortman says that's a bad idea.
You know, we need to not just hand them over their phones or their electronic gadgets. It doesn't take much to influence a child. It doesn't take much to traumatize a child. It doesn't take much to steer a child in a pathologic direction.
He says regardless if social media takes responsibility, parents have to be more aware and hands-on with their kids.
You know what you can do? You know, I heard about this choking thing. Have you heard about this thing? Because you can kill yourself that way. And you could do brain damage to yourself. I mean, we have to give them better information.
Unfortunately, sometimes that's not enough. One of the moms warned her 9-year-old daughter specifically not to ever try the blackout challenge. According to the lawsuit, the girl understood, but only 1 month later, the girl continued watching the videos and died from trying the challenge. TikTok, the most popular website last year, beating out even Google, says the blackout challenge was already a trend even before the platform took off, referencing a choking game that was popular in the 90s and 2000s.
As Washington works to stop Beijing's influence in the Pacific, 2 other countries are getting more involved. This week, the Solomon Islands told Australia that it won't allow Beijing to build a military base in its territory. Here's Australia's response.
Australia welcomed the Solomon Islands' decision to rule out a Chinese military base on its soil. The news comes after a recent China-Solomon security pact sent shockwaves throughout the West. Many voiced fears that the pact could allow China to establish its military just 1,000 miles off the coast of Australia. But the Solomon Islands Prime Minister reassured Australia that it won't be happening.
I think you've got to deal with people at face value, and he has made those comments. We, of course, have made very clear what Australia's position is on any proposal, such as the one that was mooted in the media prior to it being ruled out by Prime Minister Sogavare. So I welcome his comments ruling out there being a Chinese base in Australia.
A former director of U.S. Naval Intelligence also reacted to the remark, but shared a different perspective.
I think it's entirely plausible within the next decade we will see not only Chinese military vessels pulling into port in the Solomon Islands, but we will see PLA aircraft, which have already been there. A Y-20 resupply aircraft have flown through Henderson Field, the Guadalcanal, and done resupply operations and sent in supplies. So it's just going to increase, and saying that you feel confident that it won't happen is just hard to comprehend.
In addition to its Solomon Islands deal, Beijing had pushed a similar agreement with 10 more Pacific nations. Even though the talks failed, the Chinese regime has suggested it would make new attempts in the future. But that may get harder for China as time goes on. Both the U.S. and Australia are ramping up their engagement with the region following China's effort. And Albanese's government has promised additional spending on regional aid, totaling over $350 million US. As for Washington, Vice President Kamala Harris announced plans to triple U.S. funding to the region to $60 million over the next decade. The U.S. also plans to establish new embassies in Kiribati and Tonga, as well as bring the Peace Corps back to the region. Harris made the announcement during a virtual meeting with leaders from the Pacific Islands Forum. A day after her remarks, China held a separate political dialogue with the leaders from the Pacific region.
Sri Lanka's geopolitical value has not only brought opportunities, but also China's attention. By expanding its control in the Indo-Pacific region, China absorbed Sri Lanka into its Belt and Road Initiative. Because of that, Beijing has become the country's biggest lender. Next, we take a closer look at how Sri Lanka found itself in that situation and how it might dig itself out from under a mountain of debt.
Sri Lanka is located at a crucial junction deep within the Indo-Pacific region. First of all, let's look at its transportation value. A port in the country called Hambantota sits less than 10 miles away from one of the world's busiest shipping routes and oil transport routes. The path links two of the world's most important oil transit choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. What's more, it's a deep-water seaport, making it an ideal harbor for large warships. The value of that geography has drawn Chinese attention. Beijing wasn't subtle about its interest in the port either. A former Sri Lankan official told the New York Times that Chinese officials had said they expected Sri Lanka to let them know who is coming and stopping there. On top of its prime location, Sri Lanka is just a few hundred miles away from the shores of India, a major rival to China. In 2014, China looped Sri Lanka into its Belt and Road Initiative, a controversial project that critics call Beijing's debt trap diplomacy. Under the initiative, the Chinese regime offers billions of dollars in loans to developing countries earmarked for building up their infrastructure. But when countries fail to pay back the money, the regime takes control of their strategic assets, like ports that could prove useful for military purposes. In Sri Lanka's case, Beijing funneled billions of dollars into the country to help build up the Hambantota port. But the South Asian country was later forced to hand over control of the port to China on a 99-year contract after it failed to pay back its Chinese debt. Fast forward to today, Sri Lanka is facing a debt crisis, but some countries are lending a hand. Washington announced $120 million in grants for small and medium-sized enterprises in Sri Lanka. G7 member nations also voiced plans to help relieve Sri Lanka's debts. Neighboring India offered even more financial help. India has pledged over $4 billion in loans. It's also mulling over the possibilities of additional support, like a $500 million credit line for fuel. Comments from an international affairs expert may shed light on India's generosity. He says the country hopes to decrease Beijing's hold on Sri Lanka.
The Pakistani military has reported defects in 4 warships bought from China. They're said to fail when firing missiles. Let's take a look.
At least 4 frigates the Pakistani Navy purchased from China are defective. That's according to a report from the Eurasia Times. The finding is based on analysis from European expert Valerio Fabri. He noted that Pakistan signed a deal with China in 2005 to build F-22P or Zulfiqar-class frigates. They were sold for $750 million and delivered between 2009 and 2013. 3 of the ships were acquired from the China Shipbuilding Trading Company. One was built by Pakistan's Karachi Shipyard and Engineering Works under a technology transfer agreement with China. These frigates were intended to enhance air defense, intercept hostile surface combatants, and run patrols, among other purposes. Such missions require them to possess long-range surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missiles. But the Pakistan Navy detected issues with the search and track radars of the ship's FM-90 missile system. They were malfunctioning during high-power transmissions, so the system was unable to lock onto the target and would somehow disable the missile. All 17 defective infrared sensors on all the ships had to be discarded. Another problem involved the ship's main engines. High temperatures from the exhaust can cause them to run at a low speed. As explained by Fabri, a high degree of degradation was noticed in the engine crankcase and liner, which undermined the coolant chemistry in the ships. Lube oil degradation and deterioration of vibration isolators were some other faults in the engines. According to the Eurasia Times, problems with Chinese-made defense equipment have been well documented. The Pakistan Army used to import VT-4 main battle tanks and heavy artillery guns from Beijing. In February, the country reported quality and reliability problems with these weapons. The Royal Jordanian Air Force and the Bangladesh Air Force claimed similar deficiencies. They both identified performance problems with aircraft procured from Chinese aviation companies.
Taiwan is boosting its efforts in countering intellectual property theft by China. The island took aim at a Chinese company and Apple supplier on Friday, accusing it of stealing trade secrets from a Taiwanese supplier. Authorities say the goal was to quickly enter Apple's production chain and win orders. Taiwan said it found that China's Luxshare precision industry lured workers from Taiwanese competitor Catcher Technology. It makes cases for Apple iPhones and iPads. Taiwanese prosecutors said that Luxshare promised the workers high salaries and stole business secrets, causing big losses for Catcher. 14 people have been charged. Reuters reports that neither Luxshare nor Apple have responded to requests for comment. The move is the latest of its kind by Taiwan since May. That's when Taiwanese authorities raided 10 Chinese companies suspected of poaching microchip engineers. These companies were operating in Taiwan without approval. A United Nations report predicts China will soon lose its status as the world's most populous country. That India is now primed to take that status. Here's more on when it's set to become official.
India could be the most populous nation next year instead of China. That's according to a United Nations report called World Population Prospects 2022, or WPP. It says India's population will slightly exceed China's starting in the second half of next year. UN projections say India will continue to hold that position until the year 2100. Zooming out to the global population, the UN Secretary General said population growth fell below 1% in 2020, the lowest since 1950. Despite those significantly slowing birth rates, the organization also estimates that the world population will grow past 8 billion this year. While the WPP report predicts that the global population will reach 9 billion by 2038.
The European Union says it supports peace and the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. This after its incoming ambassador to China said the EU supports China's peaceful reunification of Taiwan. The new ambassador, Jorge Toledo Albiniana, gave a speech earlier this month. In it, he said the EU is not defending Taiwan independence, but peaceful reunification. The term peaceful reunification stems from the Chinese Communist Party. It refers to a situation where mainland China takes over Taiwan without a war. He added if China invades Taiwan, Europe, together with the U.S. and its allies, will introduce the same or even more serious measures than those they have taken against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. The ambassador has made the EU's stance to China clear. That is, the EU considers China a partner. In other remarks, he said that without China's help, the world will not be able to cope with global challenges like the pandemic and the climate crisis, adding that China is an important partner in dealing with Iran on nuclear weapons. As for trade, he emphasized the EU and China are the most important trading partners in the world. To back up his statement, he cited China's status as the second largest economy in the world and as the country with the most purchasing power. Albiniana will take up his new position in September in Beijing, representing the 27 countries of the EU.
In our previous episode, we touched on how Beijing's military expansion is touching a nerve with Western countries. But an expert says there's a catch with the Chinese regime's military power. Let's hear more from Greg Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association.
What we have to be aware of is that although the quality of the People's Republic of China's military programs and space programs is improving dramatically, and it is certainly world class, it's based largely particularly on former Soviet technology for hypersonic weapons, for space programs and the like, for its aero engines and even its fighter designs.
He says even though the Chinese regime is building a modern defense force with ships and aircrafts,
but it's using 20th century design and technology, and in many respects 20th century strategic thinking. Its whole approach, for example, to recreating the Japanese Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere by moving down through the South Pacific and looking at sea denial to its adversaries.
Copley says the question is whether Beijing can match the West's new thinking.
Particularly with the new AUKUS treaty, the Australia, United Kingdom, United States treaty, which is focusing on the creation of new technology, weapons, and thinking so that you don't try to catch up with the PRC in terms of sheer numbers of ships and the like, but rather to eclipse the People's Liberation Army by dramatic new technologies which are being developed by the private sectors in, as I say, Britain, Australia, and the United States.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a real pleasure to welcome Prime Minister Payne back to
that security deal generated a lot of buzz when it was announced.
A new national security initiative. Beijing said the pact was extremely irresponsible.
Under it, the three countries will deepen their cooperation in a wide range of defense technologies. Among the priorities are artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, and quantum computing. It also promised to get Australia nuclear-powered submarines.
This partnership has never been stronger. It's never been more important.
But some are concerned about whether there's enough time. Beijing is aiming to be on par with U.S. military by 2027. But Australia is unlikely to get any nuclear submarines until the late 2030s. The clock is ticking. And here's Copley's argument.
There's never enough time to do things right. And all wars, when they eventually begin, are come-as-you-are wars. They don't ask whether you're ready. Wars tend to break out and you have to respond with whatever you have. And there's always going to be new technology available tomorrow or the next day. So you just have to keep developing as rapidly as possible and deploying as rapidly as possible.
He says the threat of imminent conflict tends to speed up investment in new capabilities and points out that AUKUS is trying to make the most of its limited budget and manpower.
So what we'll see, and we could see it within the next couple of years, is that, for example, even Australia could have long-range strategic strike weapons, hypersonic weapons, which could deliver standoff punishment to the People's Republic of China or the PLA forces if they attempt to encroach further southward.
Australia's former defense minister has said Australian warships would have long-range strike missiles by 2024. That's 3 years earlier than the expected timeline.
This is about Australia being prepared and making sure that we can stare down any active bullying against our country.
As for the current balance of power in the Indo-Pacific,
in reality, the US and Australia and New Zealand particularly have an advantage in the South Pacific particularly and in the Indo-Pacific overall. However, the psychological war which is underway gives the perception that the US and its allies are in confusion and on the defensive, whereas Beijing is on the offensive and is moving solidly. Now, this is a moving game of chess.
One issue is still hanging in the air, though, the safety of Taiwan.
The question is, will Beijing think that it has a limited time open to it, a window of opportunity open to it, where it must strike Taiwan, where it must expand dramatically into the South Pacific, or whether it has to wait until it has overwhelming superiority, which it may never get.
And how does the safety of Taiwan impact the U.S.?
There's no question that Taiwan and the whole question of People's Republic of China expansion is the great security concern for the United States and for the West generally. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is a small affair in overall historical terms. It's a great tragedy, of course, in individual terms, but it is a distraction from what is strategically important. And it's the Indo-Pacific, it's the question of Taiwan's security, which is the key to control of the Central Pacific.
90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan. Without these tiny chips, our computers, iPhones, and fighter jets wouldn't be possible. The island also sits on a crucial location. It's on a line of defense stretching from Japan to Malaysia, which prevents Beijing from launching submarine-based missile attacks against the U.S. But major world events are competing for Washington's attention and resources.
The Communist Party of China were virtually saved by the Russia-Ukraine war because it distracted US and Canadian and NATO interests generally back into the Euro-Atlantic sphere. It took away vast amounts of defense capability from the Indo-Pacific and has allocated them to Ukraine.
Along the same line, Congress's aid to Ukraine has topped $54 billion.
This is a fairly substantial amount of diversion of military capability.
Washington has told Taiwan that it might delay some major weapons deliveries to the island because it's focusing on arming Ukraine. Taiwan was expecting to get 250 Stinger missiles by 2026, but now there's a risk of delay. Meanwhile, the U.S. has sent over 1,400 Stinger missiles to Ukraine. Back to the money issue. With a limited defense budget, what can the U.S. do? Copley notes there's a new trend in the defense industry, where small firms are making certain weapons at a lower cost and a faster rate. He recommends that the Pentagon spend its money more effectively by moving away from traditional heavy manufacturers and embracing smaller, more diverse firms. Juliet Song, NTD News.